I want to bring in Kieran Gilbert and Andrew Clennell, who are listening to that happening there at Parliament House in Canberra, in the House. Kieran, what do you make of it? He was doubling down. I thought this was a legacy-protecting speech.
100%, Laura. And you mentioned that apology to those affected by his secrecy around that, but that's right. There was an apology to those individuals, but unrepentant when it comes to his approach more broadly. Inexplicably, he said, if I was asked about this, I would have answered truthfully, but who on earth would have thought that he would secretly swear himself into half a dozen portfolios? So that was a bit odd. Overall, though, I thought it was a forceful and quite a powerful address, to be honest, in terms of repudiating this censure. I thought he did pretty well to characterise how well Australia did, how his government had performed better than most, and that everything he did was reasonable. But as I say, there were a few moments where I think he sort of stretched credulity. One of them as well was where he said he never used these powers. They were dormant. Well, they weren't. He did use them on one occasion. And if you used it on one, who's to say that there wasn't going to be other scenarios where he would? He did use it. On the Pep 11 case, that was a clear-cut matter where he basically took the powers, overrode the minister, and did that. So that's the reality. The other thing I would say, Laura, just to wrap up an initial sort of assessment, is that internally there is still a lot of anger towards Scott Morrison about this. They are still furious with him for his behaviour in this, in that period, the secrecy and all of that. He did apologise to those individuals, as we've said. But more broadly, this was a defiant Scott Morrison defending his approach to government and defending his performance as Prime Minister, Laura.
Yeah, I agree. He is largely friendless in that place. I thought the intervention of Alex Hawke, even though Alex Hawke wished to couch it in different terms from his original statement for this book, didn't really smooth over things. But I also, when you talk about stretching credulity, part of that speech just there, he said, had I been asked, I would have answered honestly about the ministries. Well, no one knew to ask, and it wouldn't be a usual question to ask at a media conference in the middle of a pandemic. The instruction on my faith, he said, invoking his faith once again, I will turn the other cheek. He also said, I have seen bitterness destroy people in this place, and he will not and never be one of them. Whilst that speech was very forceful, I still didn't feel like it came across as bitter, Andrew. Yes, he was still talking in the House like he was Prime Minister. There was no backing down from that. And as I said, legacy protecting.
Yes, well, I think there's some risk for Labor in this, and I said that yesterday, and the risk is that they're seen to be kicking a man when he's down. And I think Morrison did a pretty good job then of pointing that out. I thought it was a strong counter-attack from him. Burke had decided to be measured, but it didn't quite do the job in a sense. And I'm a bit surprised Albanese didn't then jump up and attack him, but maybe he seemed to walk out as soon as Morrison spoke, but maybe he's just decided, I don't want to get my hands dirty on this, even though it's all of his making. Look, there's an issue here with Scott Morrison, and that is that just as when I confronted him at the only press conference he's done on this matter, he still can't really explain why he did this. And it just looks like he was being sneaky, frankly, and being a control freak. But I guess you can't get up and say, well, I was being sneaky and being a control freak, can you? And the issue around that is, why wouldn't you tell two of your closest colleagues, Matthias Cormann and Josh Frydenberg? Well, the only reason I can come up with is you're afraid of their reaction. And that seems to me what occurred. I think Scott Morrison lost his mind, quite frankly, in relation to these secret ministries. I'm glad to, even if it was only a half apology, that he gave some sort of apology to his colleagues and indicated it should be legislated against in the future. So there were strong parts of that speech, but there were also weak parts in the sense that there are still these gaps in his story, if you like, for Scott Morrison. And look, it is embarrassing for him, let's face it. He blew it. I probably would have gone more a full-throated apology, to be honest, but still defended the legacy. The one thing you didn't mention in the legacy, and he's right about the health and economic outcomes of Australia. They do compare well to the rest of the world. We are an island country, so we had that. Any government in power had that advantage to turn off the international borders, if you like. His great failing, as we all know, is the vaccine rollout. And one of the reasons Australia was one of the most locked down jurisdictions in the world, which affected a lot of people's mental health, particularly in Melbourne, was because he didn't do enough on the vaccine. And as much as these other things he spoke about are his legacy, unfortunately for Scott Morrison, so is that.
Yeah, Andrew, he did speak a lot about hindsight. He called on the House and really everyone else watching to consider the unknowns around the pandemic. But when you talk about hindsight, there is a wonderful thing where you can look at things and think, well, we didn't do that quite right. So on the same side, a different side of that coin, he didn't apologise for things in hindsight that, you could do now, which is, I guess, what this censure motion is all about. But Kira, before I let you both go, when it comes down to it, a censure motion is really a parliamentary slap on the wrist, but it is part of our Westminster system. I think many people at home, having lived through the last 3 years though, the reality is would have been nodding along, agreeing with a lot of what Scott Morrison said.
Yeah, and you're right, it is a slap on the wrist. It's symbolic. And I think the government will see this as a full stop in the saga. They might have the odd crack during question time next year and beyond, but I think in terms of actually making this an issue, this is the censure. It's done. It's the response to the Bell report. And I think Andrew's right. They need then to move on because that scenario of just kicking someone when they're down, having lost, and the comment of Scott Morrison to win gracefully sort of refers to that, I think. After this, the government, I think, knows this. They've got to move on. The odd crack aside, fine, but you've done the censure. OK, get on with doing what's important to and for the Australian people. A couple of points to make, Laura, further to that. Very interesting tone from Tony Burke when he spoke. He was deliberately not going to be incendiary. He wanted to be calm and
he was serious
sort of to say
and
that this
somber,
is,
wasn't he? It was almost like democracy was on the line.
Yeah, exactly. More out of sorrow than anger that we're doing this. We don't want to be doing this and kicking our political opponent while he's down. Yeah, as if that can be believed. But that was certainly the effort. He was being very sombre and calm and so on. So that was obviously very deliberate. The other thing I'd say, Laura, is this is a very unusual situation we're seeing here. It's intriguing to watch and fascinating, I think, for our viewers to see Scott Morrison there on the defence and in that position. But let's just think about how rare this is, because prime ministers, when they lose, they're not often still in the chamber to cop a censure. And to be there to defend their legacy in this scenario. So they're normally out. And as far back as I can remember, they're gone. So there wouldn't be in this scenario where it's a difficult moment for Morrison. It's a fall from grace for Morrison. But he was defiant, and it's a rare moment. That's for sure, Laura.
It certainly is. Andrew, just
Laura,
quickly.
just wanted to point out too, after his speech, apparently, Joel Philp tells us from the chamber that a lot of colleagues were patting Morrison on the back, shaking his hand, offering hugs and kisses before he walked out. So a lot of support from the coalition side there for the former Prime Minister.
OK, interesting to note. Andrew, Kieran, thanks so much for joining AM Agenda. Appreciate it.
Laura.
See you soon.